Okay, good evening, everyone. Well, tonight I'm going to, kind of out of the blue, start talking about the Robocop franchise. First off, I've always had a soft spot for this particular vein of hard R sci-fi. Stuff like this or the Terminator, it's just right up my alley. There's just something about that whole sort of like lo-fi run-down future aesthetic that I just can't get enough of. I don't know what it is, but just something about that whole style and that whole setting. I just, as a cinephile, find it just totally sexy. I can't help it, I'm sorry. To the best of my recollection, Robocop was in fact the very first hard R sci-fi movie that I ever watched as a kid. I can remember getting it from the video store and at the time only being familiar with the children's toys that were marketed everywhere. Yeah, some of you might remember this was back when rated R properties were being marketed to kids via toys and Happy Meals. To be perfectly fair, Robocop did have a couple of more sort of like youth-oriented animated spin-offs and things like that, but nevertheless, it was very weird when I finally got back to the source as a kid and got to experience this movie. That's not to say I was scared or disgusted per se, but it really blew me back. Like, it's kind of like that feeling when you ride a roller coaster for the first time or go and see an IMAX movie for the first time, and you know it's a really cool experience, but it's just such a catapulting, exhilarating, and also sort of, disorienting sensation that you're not quite sure whether to feel more tingly or scared or what. Like, and somewhere in the back of your head, you're going to survive and come out the other end having had a lot of fun. But that initial jolt is sort of like that feeling of jumping out with a parachute. And I don't really think that this movie is violent for the sake of being violent, but it's also impossible to talk about this movie without talking about the violence because it is such a huge part of the aesthetic here. Most of it, though, is honestly the kind of exaggerated violence that you might expect from an adult comic book or graphic novel, or maybe even heavy metal magazine or something like that. You know, it's the kind of violence that is so exaggerated and so articulate in its exaggeration, it ultimately stops being gruesome and graphic and becomes more surrealistic. Even the scene where the character Murphy, played by Peter Weller, before he's converted into Robocop, when he's murdered, it's a very grisly scene for sure. But if you can sort of step back and like take a look at it and think about it sort of intellectually for a second, human bodies don't fly apart like that. Even with shotguns and pistols, they just don't. It doesn't happen. But I never actually ask myself that question or think about it that way while I'm watching it, because Peter Weller's committed performance and the editing make the whole moment feel much more nasty and visceral and raw than it actually is. And if you can get your hands on one of the director's cuts with all of the action fully restored, I think it is worth your time because it gives you a better idea of how much effort they went to and how much had to be trimmed just to get this into a theater. And I mean, granted, they only have the theatrical cut on Tubi, which kind of makes me grit my teeth. But at the same time, even in its theatrically edited form, this is still a decidedly hard R. I don't think anyone could complain that the theatrical cut doesn't still have teeth. It also helps that this isn't just a simple action film, which was the other thing that surprised me as a kid, along with the sheer extremity of the material. I was also rather struck by how smart and thoughtful and sometimes just flat out funny the movie was too. One thing, what separates him from a character like the Terminator, and I love the Terminator movies, don't get me wrong, but unlike the Terminator, Robocop is not a manufactured robot. I mean, I think he's more technically a cyborg anyways, but yeah, we're not here to get into that. The point is that he began human and he becomes less so, which means even though it is in a lot of ways continuing to dwindle, his humanity still has a residual effect on everything that he is doing in his new form as a mechanized cop. Peter Weller is actually very good at doing subtle things with his voice, like his inflection, his cadence, and just the way he kind of turns his head and twists his body sometimes. to put a lot of flavor on what are, some pretty deliberately robotic and plain spoken lines. You always sense a very human intelligence and personality behind a lot of his behavior. And there are even hints here and there, both in this movie and in Robocop 2, where you get the feeling, or at least maybe the suspicion, that on some level Murphy slash Robocop is pretending to be more of a robot in a situation than he actually is. Almost like he's deliberately trying to throw them off the trail and conceal his real motives in a situation. And I love that they keep that part ambiguous and kind of up to your own interpretation. Even during the sequences where we're inside Robocop's head in more ways than one, we're only seeing what his programming is allowing him to see. We're experiencing it, but it's not being explained to us any more than it's being explained to him. And in an era where we're constantly bleeding into technology in terms of our identities more and more, it's hard not to watch this guy kind of struggle to maintain his sense of self against the technology that is sort of enshrouding him, and feel some sense of relatability. Another thing that, if anything, does feel more prescient now than it did back then is the way that we can see how Murphy's own personality informs his performance as a cyborg cop or Robocop. And when you think about how things have developed recently in terms of the ongoing controversy around police violence, and the changes that need to be made in terms of the screening and selection process for who's allowed to be a cop, this does actually give you a lot to chew on in that department, as well as just finding a cool way to illustrate the moral dilemma that at some point I'm sure all police officers face between what the law dictates they should do, much the same way that Murphy's programming dictates what he should do, and what their hearts, what the human in them believes is right and thinks should be done. It does sort of help you appreciate how sometimes I think we take the humanity of police officers for granted too. It's a nice way of generating a more healthy sense of empathy towards these people, even if you can't necessarily support all their actions. I just love the casting in this one too. Like, aside from Ronnie Cox, who was actually playing against type here as Dick Jones, it's kind of ironic that he's the only guy, I think, amongst the supporting cast, or at least a good part of them, who wasn't seasoned at playing a dick in the movies by this point. You've got Kurtwood Smith, Miguel Ferrer, Ray Wise, Alan Graff is even in there in a small part. Alan Graff, some of you will know as Captain Turner from Deadwood. It really does feel like Paul Verhoeven advised his casting director, like, look, just send me everyone in Hollywood who knows how to play a good dick and is available. And you can just tell they're all having a blast. Like, they just radiate it, They are having such a good time in this movie. Their energy is totally contagious. Here and there, the script kind of lets them down a little bit. Like, as much as I still would, on the whole, consider this movie pretty well a masterpiece, and to a degree, some of the clunkiness and stupidity in the dialogue is, I'm sure, deliberate satire. There are still times where it is a bit too clunky, or if not clunky, at least a little bit first drafty or simplistic. I mean, I'm not going to list all of them, but even the part when Dick Jones says, I killed Bob Morton because he made a mistake, now it's time to erase that mistake. It feels like, again, a bit too on the nose, a bit too literate. Similarly, some of the lines that Kurtwood Smith has when he and Ronnie Cox, Dick Jones again, a lot of dicking around in this movie. When they're arguing in Jones's office about how to handle Robocop, some of the lines that Kurtwood Smith has to utter are almost a little bit cringy, but fortunately he's a talented enough actor that he's able to shoulder them without it really sinking anything too much. Plus, given that a lot of the satire in this film springs from the idea that people are so desensitized and so cynical that violent tragedies happening right in front of them are pretty much just a joke at this point, it sort of follows, I guess, that along with a lack of ability to relate to others, the way that people might speak and act towards each other is also going to be less relatable, and as a byproduct of that, sometimes a little less believable. I mean, in some instances. In others, like even again, I'm thinking of a lot of the lines that the various characters have in the scene where Murphy is killed by the gang. Some of that is just simplistic dialogue that should have been either cut or filled out a little bit more. But really, genre fans don't go to a movie like this for the dialogue any more than they might visit Pornhub for the acting. Putting aside the psychological and philosophical themes completely, this still functions and entertains extremely well as a piece of pulpy, violent, high concept science fiction. The sound design really goes a long way, enhancing a lot of the action too, even with the character, or the robot, I suppose I should say, called Ed 209, the one that shoots that poor bastard in the very opening scene. And all that happens there is, Dick Jones just gets a slap on the wrist and the old man saying, "I'm very disappointed in you." If you haven't seen Robocop, by some off chance, the old man isn't just me forgetting the character's name. This character's name, the big CEO, the chair of OCP, is literally referred to in the credits as the old man. That's what he's called there. That's what everyone else in the movie calls him too. But the whole design of Ed 209, even though he looks like an antiquated electric shaver with legs, he still manages to be a bit threatening in his presence, and part of that is the sound design, just the low hum and all the wheezing mechanical noises that come out of him when he starts moving around. It's got its bass dropped and it's mixed in with the sounds of a big cat. I think it was either like maybe a leopard or a cheetah or something like that, growling and grumbling, and it really gives off the impression of a machine that is not just big and hulking, but also pissed off and hostile. And in the case of Ed 209, not the sharpest tack in the box, given how easily Robocop eventually fools him. I love the scene when he topples down the stairs and he's sitting there in the stairwell writhing on his back, making all those squealing noises. It's disturbing and scary, and almost even generates a modicum of sympathy at the same time, because I think just instinctively, none of us like the idea of being trapped on our back and unable to get up. That's exactly what you watch this robot go through. I mean, there's many sequences where you realize that this thing is basically functioning with the intelligence of a child, except that when this thing has tantrums or has sort of like mental fog, people die. You don't just end up with shit in a diaper. People get shot to bits. And how could I not mention the part where the character Emil drives the truck right into that vat of toxic waste and falls out the back side of the truck with his skin literally melting off his body. I mean, that really shook me up and threw me for a loop again when I watched it for the first time when I was a kid. Like, I didn't even want to go in the shower. I was too scared to take a shower after that, which makes no sense whatsoever, really, does it? But nevertheless, I did not want to go in the shower. But that is great makeup and prosthetics work, and just that awful howling, hollow, wheezing noise erupting out of his mouth and never stopping. It's just, ooh, man, it's so delightfully gross. And then when he splatters all over the hood of the car, perfect. And the humor and satire is something that really comes to the forefront for me watching it this time round with older eyes. Like, some of those newscast segments and the fake commercials that go along with them are hilarious. Like, I mean, the first one that comes to my mind is the game where basically the whole family gets together to pretend that they're declaring nuclear war on each other. Ho ho ho. Oh look, Dad, I just blew up Pakistan. Ha 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 ha. Oh, hilarious. I mean, if you looked on the dark web or something, you could probably find a real game like that pretty quick. I'd almost guarantee it at this point. Just the nice little recurring gag of having that billboard showing up in various places. The one that says Delta City, the future has a silver lining. Meanwhile, you've got cops driving broken down cars on either unpaved or severely neglected roads and highway. Or in other scenes, the billboard is hanging above the scene as two criminals attempt to assault a woman before Robocop comes, of course. It's not a joke per se, but it's just one of those nice little recurring winks or nudges that reminds you that what you're watching at the end of the day is actually intended to be fun. Of course, we also have the car of the future, the 6000 SUX. And here's the thing, when it got to the scene in the movie where that one police officer is on the megaphone trying to negotiate a hostage situation, when the guy demands that he get a car and the lieutenant or whoever it was responds through the megaphone with, well, how about I get you the 6000 SUX? I have to admit, having not seen this in a while, I was watching this and thinking like, oh, that's kind of clever, the cop's being a smartass. Until, of course, a little bit later on in the movie when you actually get to see an ad, and sure enough, this car is in fact called the 6000 SUX. I don't know if that was deliberately set up that way to toy with you playfully, but it wouldn't surprise me. Now, for all the things that I enjoy about this movie, did it really need a sequel? Let's be honest, probably not. For the whole wealth of satire and nuance and intrigue that this character and this scenario offers in this movie, there's ultimately only so far you can go with a character who is this robotic, whether he's a cyborg or not. The way that he is written and played, it does have its limits. I hate to think that the reason that they pushed for sequels was kind of one of those Warner Brothers Batman and Robin situations where underneath it all, it was just a bunch of greedy marketing bastards looking for an excuse to sell more toys. But let's face it, stranger things have happened. So there you have it. I think that's enough for now. Once again, absolutely love this movie. Some small, tiny nitpicks in the dialogue here and there aside, this is everything that I could want in an R-rated science fiction movie. I pretty much adore this thing. Again, if you've never seen any of the uncensored cuts, I encourage you to seek them out. But if you're looking to be thrifty, this theatrical cut, as well as the sequels and the TV series, the live-action TV series that is, are all available to stream on Tubi. P.S. The satirical ads that pop up throughout the franchise mesh in a very interesting way with Tubi's real ads, but I'll let you see that for yourself. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Look for an installment on Robocop 2 coming soon if I can help it, and I will catch you all later. Take care.